Welcome, everyone, to this event. I've done a couple other events at this forum before, and one of the things that I say, and I really do mean it, and I mean it every single time, is that this will be the highlight of the weekend for you. So I'm really glad you're all here and not missing it. I have the privilege of introducing our guest here to my left, Harold Korell. Mr. Carell is a graduate of the Colorado School of Mines with a professional degree in chemical and petroleum refining engineering. He began his career with Mobil Oil Corporation and is a licensed professional engineer in the states of Texas and Colorado. Mr. Carell serves as the Dean's Advisory Board of the Walton College at the University of Arkansas and the Board of Governors of the Colorado School of Mines. Now, Mr. Carell is particularly known in his role in serving as the CEO of Southwestern Energy from 1998 through early 2010. He was named the 2006 Executive of the Year by Oil and Gas Investor magazine. He retired in 2010 and now currently serves as the chairman of the board of Southwestern Energy. Southwestern is one of the top 10 companies in the United States oil and gas exploration and production business. Southwestern Energy ranked 49th on the Forbes 200 Best Small Companies in 2005 until, under Mr. Carell here, it grew to one of the 400 Best Big Companies by 2009. During Mr. Carell's tenure as CEO, Southwestern was the top performing company in the S&P 500 in the U.S. broad market in total shareholder return. Just to bring that home to probably most of you out there, Southwestern Energy outperformed Apple stock during that time. That's pretty impressive. So, what is it? What did Mr. Carell do that at least the stock market thought had a bigger effect on our lives than seemingly the ubiquitous Apple? Mr. Carell, it's fair to say, has been at the forefront of an economic transformation that will have far-reaching effects on our economy. He led Southwestern in the discovery of one of the largest natural gas fields in the country, the Fayetteville Shale in Arkansas, which you'll talk about. After decades of decline in producing energy and relying on energy imports from the Middle East and other parts of the world, the United States has had a huge turnaround, and Mr. Carell's company has led this renewal of investment in our resources here in the United States. The implications are significant economically and politically. Now, what I hope you'll get out of this time here today is to see what lies behind his success. And what lies behind his success, I think, you're going to see is the adventure of a man with a great curiosity, a tremendous realism, and a compelling passion for life. I imagine most people in this audience are not involved in the energy sector. But what I think will resonate is the response of a man's freedom in front of the great positivity of reality, the invitation to discover more, the marvel of creation. Mr. Carell, thank you for being here.
Thank you. You want me to begin? You want me to begin?
Yeah, if you could, Mr. Carell, I think begin is probably the story that I think is just so fascinating about your experiences is the discovery of the Fayetteville Shale, and a little bit about what you did as the CEO of Southwestern.
Sure, well, I'd be happy to try to share that story with you. First of all, I am very uncomfortable because I can't see anyone out there. So, Carla, are you out there? Yeah, I do see you raising your hand. So, this afternoon I'll try to share some of my experiences with you. Some of those will be a business experience, and some of those will relate to my personal life and experiences that I've had. And maybe those two together can give you the answer to some of the questions that I've been asked to respond to here. First thing I want to say is that as I thought about setting up here at this table, I thought, how in the world are we going to make this interesting? Two businessmen with music and other things going on the rest of the time. And it is a challenge, so I talked my partner into taking his tie off, and so that we both don't have ties on now. I retired from Southwestern Energy at the end of March of 2010, and I was, at the time, 65 years old. Somehow throughout my life, I guess I'd gotten the feeling that you ought to retire at 65, but yet I had plenty of energy, knowledge, experience, background that could have been useful in the business. I had various experiences over my lifetime with different energy companies, and when I say energy companies, I mean what we call in the business upstream companies, those companies who look for, try to discover oil and gas, which has driven most of our energy needs around the world for many years and still will in spite of other developments that hopefully will come along as we go forward. I had a lot of knowledge. I still had a lot of energy left. I had been with a company, Southwestern Energy, that had the good fortune to have discovered a very large energy source. And to give that a little bit of perspective here, in the energy industry itself, for the past 100 years, we have produced oil and gas from rocks under the earth that we call sandstones or carbonate rocks. So either consolidated beach sand, if you will, it's been buried very deep under the earth, and oil or gas had migrated into those, and we drilled into those and produced it. Either sandstones or carbonates. Carbonates, think of those as rocks that are formed along a carbonate shelf in the Bahamas or in the Caribbean or somewhere where there's a lot of shell, fish, and carbonate material. And those kinds of rocks, sandstones and carbonates, have the capacity, have a lot of porosity, so they have a lot of pore space between the mineral segments themselves to store oil and gas. But oil and gas really was created in shale rocks. And shale rocks are very fine-grained, silty materials that are so fine you can hardly see them, and they settled to the floor of the ocean at some point in time. And organic material was settled in there with those materials. And then as the earth evolved and those things got buried deeper under the earth, those shale, that material would have formed a shale rock. And if it got buried deep enough, it would have, the kerogen, the organic material, the remains of fish and other animals, would have been converted into oil. And if it gets buried even deeper under more pressure and temperature, it becomes natural gas. And our industry has always understood that oil and gas originates in shales, but we'd never been able to figure out how to produce it from those shales because those rocks themselves are like tombstone. They're so hard and lack permeability and porosity. There is porosity, it's very fine grained, but the oil and gas wouldn't flow very well through those rocks. Now, over geological time, as the oil or gas formed in those rocks, some of it was expulsed and went up to other reservoirs, which we called the sandstones. I said sandstones and carbonates, and would have been captured there. And that's where our industry had made a living for 100 years or more. And sometime around in the late 80s, a company in Texas started experimenting with a shale rock in Texas near Fort Worth. It's called the Barnett Shale. And they worked and worked and worked, and they were drilling wells into it, trying to produce from it. And they would produce some oil or some gas, but not enough to pay for the drilling. And then there came a time when they began to have some success at it. And all of us in the industry thought that's the only one there is because no one had ever produced from shales really anywhere else in the world. And this was a company called Mitchell Energy. And they had begun to get an inkling of making that work. In fact, it was becoming probably profitable enough to drill, to pay for the wells, and get some economic return. And at Southwestern Energy, we happened to be doing some work in Arkansas trying to explore for a sandstone that I mentioned earlier, the conventional plays. And that was brought about at a time because natural gas prices were high, and this was we began this work back in 2000, and natural gas prices in the winter of 2000, 2001, some of you may remember your heating bills being very high then. Well, with higher prices, we thought we should go back in and try to investigate whether we could produce more gas out of those sandstones. And that really is the story of what caused our success in that then caused the Southwestern could completely change, and it caused the energy for North America and, in fact, ultimately for the world to have changed. Because when we found the Fayetteville Shale that had existed in Arkansas, it's a similar geological age to that in Texas, and when we figured out how to make that work, that's what has now led to the development of the shale reservoirs, both gas and in North Dakota now oil. So I want to, that's sort of the background about how we did so well from 2000 to 2010. The comment that we were the top performing company in the S&P 500 and exceeded the return, the total shareholder return of Apple computers, which is pretty amazing, and it was fascinating for me to be able to lead the company that did achieve that. I think the important thing maybe is to share the how-to, how did we do that, maybe starts back with this formula that I think you can see on one of the screens up there above. And I want to take you back to a time when things weren't so good at Southwestern Energy. I joined the company in 1997 as the Chief Operating Officer, and in October of 1998, the company lost a lawsuit about a gas contract that had been written and made 20 years earlier in time, and it was about some details in the contract that I won't get into. But the point of it is I joined this company, and all at once here's this lawsuit that's been pending, and we lose a judgment of $109 million. Now let me tell you, just having joined the company and having a company whose market capitalization was about $200 million, having a liability to pay $109 million is pretty devastating. And to say the least, no one on Wall Street became very interested in Southwestern Energy. And at that time, the prior CEO retired, and I became the CEO of the company. And so from October of 1998, when a lot of people thought we would be bankrupt, until June 22nd of 2000, we appealed that lawsuit to the Supreme Court in Arkansas. On June 22nd, we lost. But in the interim, between the lower court decision and the final outcome, my job as the CEO was to go around the country, try to interest shareholders, people who might invest in our company. And believe me, in that time period, no one wanted to talk to me. It was, I come to New York, and we would be lucky if we could get a meeting set up. We didn't get invited to conferences. Occasionally we would, but very small ones. And during that time, I had a hard time figuring out how to talk about Southwestern Energy. And I had a meeting one day in which I asked the top 5 people who worked for me, it was our regular Monday morning meeting, I said to them, here's our problem. The assets of the company, if we just sold the company's assets right then, just said, okay, we're selling, whoever wants to buy the oil and gas we have in the ground, and had an auction, for example, that would create, let's say, a number, whatever number, let's say X. And the problem was that our enterprise value, the market value of the company as represented by our stock and debt, was less than that. So, of course, that creates a huge amount of angst amongst your shareholders. Well, why don't you guys just sell what you have and you all go home, we won't have to pay you. And that was what was in my head. And one of the people who were there at this meeting said, well, we shouldn't do this because we've got the right people here. We have recruited some people that know how to find oil and gas, and we got to stick with it. And someone else said, we've also rationalized our areas of activity, and we're only working in certain specific areas geologically in Oklahoma, South Louisiana, New Mexico, Texas, where we had real expertise, and therefore we should keep going. And I said, the problem is that every CEO walks around the country trying to convince people that they have the best people and that they're doing the right stuff, they are in the right areas. But there's nothing unique about that. And as I was sitting there, this concept of this formula came into my head. And this might look like a marketing thing or an electrical engineering thing, but I am an engineer by background, a lot of math behind me. And I grabbed a marker pen and I stood up on a marker board and I wrote this thing, R squared over A, and I wrote an equal sign where that funny little arrow is. And I said, guys, what this means to me, the two R's are the right people doing the right things. And then in the first writing of this, I said, the right people doing the right things supported by the underlying assets will create value. And that became the calling card for Southwestern Energy. We put that on our annual report in 1999, and I began to talk to Wall Street about this. And believe me, it wasn't easy talking then because no one really cared. They all said to me, that's soft stuff. You know, we want the heart, we want the facts. You know, we want the numbers. We want to know when you're going to deliver. And I said, look, the real bet here is this. If we are the right people doing the right things and we wisely invest the cash flow from the underlying assets, we will create more value over time than you will get if we just sell the assets today. And for those of you who understand present value economics and don't want to get too detailed here, we used a very disciplined approach in our investing, in our decision making, that said we would not invest in projects unless they would achieve, using a 10% discount factor of projected future cash flows out of a given project, where the present value discounted at 10% of those future cash flows divided by the investment we made at least added 30 cents of profit. And believing that ultimately if we kept to that discipline, we would perform and we would achieve superior results. Now, the results speak for themselves nowadays, but how did that all work internally? You know, when I say one of the R's, the right people, you know, to me, and I've heard this is sort of a theme of this conference, the thing that I've discovered over time about people who are successful in the oil and gas business, because in the part we're in, it's about discovery. The real value creation happens when you find a new source of gas or oil. Now, you have to have people who can get it out of the ground, operate it, engineer it, get it to the pipeline, get it to the markets. But those are all, if you want to think of them sort of as service-driven activities that you need to do them well and you need to do them at low cost. But the real value creation in our business, and it's the same in the tech business, is if you discover or create something brand new that wasn't there before. And what we're really talking about in oil and gas is that oil and gas is first found in people's minds. You may hear a lot about technology. If you follow this business, you hear about fracturing, and we wouldn't be able to get the gas out of these shales if we didn't break the rock up, which is what fracturing is, by pumping the water and sand in there. But the point of it is that had we not discovered the Fayetteville Shale, which no one had thought of before, if we had not discovered it, and that happened in one, I should probably tell you the story about how that came about, but had that not occurred, then today the industry would not be drilling in the Marcellus Shale, any of these places, and the 100-year supply of natural gas that we've now discovered as an industry would not be available to fuel the economies in this country. And that whole technology and that whole idea is now, because everyone realizes there are the potential for this in any basin that has had produced oil and gas in the past, this is now happening all around the world. So I think maybe it's important to understand, and for this dialogue to understand how that came about. I mentioned that we were looking to exploit a sandstone, but let me talk about that in terms of sort of that whole process of the Fayetteville discovery and then development in terms of another sort of theoretical approach to people and curiosity and discovery and innovation. And I go back for that to an article that I read many years ago by a very bright business consultant, philosopher type of guy whose name was Peter Drucker. And Peter Drucker wrote about innovation. And I got interested in innovation sometime around 1984 when an officer of the company I was working for at that time stood in front of a group of us. I would happen to be in a California division of a company, and he came out to visit us, and he was a big, large guy, and he was at a podium, and he lurched over the podium. He was very big, and he said, "Now, men," like Patton or something, you know, "men, you've got to be innovative. You've got to go out there and innovate." And I was a young manager then, and I had the responsibility for the idea generation in that part of the company at that time. And I thought to myself, I was young, I was trying to learn how to do this. And I thought, well, what does he mean? I guess I know what innovate means. It means like the GE light bulb or something that used to, be advertised on TV. It would like, an idea would go on. But I kept thinking, well, what the hell if I don't get a light bulb? How do I, how do you innovate? And how can I try to get all these people who work for me to innovate? And so this Peter Drucker article explained it this way. If you have a pencil, write these things down. There were areas that he talked about in his article about areas in which you could have innovation. One of those he talked about was incongruities. I want to go back to incongruities real quickly. You probably know what it is, but one incongruity I faced in 1998 between then and 2000 was the incongruity that the assets of our company, this formula again, the assets down there of our company, if we just sold them, was worth more than our market capitalization. And that's an incongruity that's a bad one. You can't let that exist or somebody will buy you and put you out of business. So he said incongruities give you an opportunity for insight into innovation. That's number one, incongruities. The second one he talked about was unexpected occurrences. Sometimes something happens and you didn't expect it, and that might also be an opportunity, an insight into innovation. The third, which we're almost used to, is something he called process needs, and that's real easy. Something is just not working, and you say, well, I got to figure out a better way to do this because the way I'm putting my shoes on in the morning isn't working. I got to put my foot up on something so I can tie it because I can't stoop over too good anymore. Whatever. The process needs are what we think about, that we engineer our way to improvements and innovations in terms of it's an area to innovate. The other one that Peter Drucker talked about was, he called it demographic changes. Along comes the baby boomers and here's all this opportunity, but I like to call that one instead paradigm shifts, which kind of means a little bit the same thing, but a little bit different. So how did all that work in the Fayetteville? What happened in the very beginning is, I mentioned that in 2000, when oil or natural gas prices were high at the end of 2000 going into 01, we put an effort, a small team of people working to go in and map in an area where our company had drilled some wells 20 or 30 years before. And they hadn't been very good wells, but they had produced some amount of gas. And with prices being higher, I said, well, could we drill more there? So the way you do that, if you're a company and in the technical work, you go in, you make a map, you say, here's the area, here's where we've drilled, and how thick was the sand where we drilled here and here and here, and you make a map of that. And you can calculate then, if you know the height, the thickness times the area equals volume. And so you would know, and times some porosity, like what the percentage space of the rock is open to store gas. And you could calculate how much gas was there. And then from that, using reasonable assumptions, you could say how much gas you should have produced out of those wells over 30 years. Well, when the geologist did that work, he found that those wells had actually produced between 4 and 7 times more gas than they should have, based on the science. And that was an opportunity for innovation. Now, many times this can go either way. That geologist could have said, well, there's something wrong with my assumptions. It is the way that it is, and that's it. Fortunately, Philip Shelby, who was the geologist who did this, I have a soft spot in my heart for him because he said something, there's an incongruity here, and something's not fitting. And he brought this to the attention of the person he worked for, and I very quickly was brought into the equation as well. And we took off to put a bigger team of people on this, because what we found when we really looked in detail then was we had drilled these wells and completed them in the sandstone, that old reservoir, but both right adjacent to it, contiguous to it, above and below it, was a shale, and that turned out to be the Fayetteville Shale. And what we said is, well, maybe some gas was coming from that shale. And if it is, we also knew that in Texas, Mitchell was trying to make the Barnett Shale work, and it turns out that these two rocks, God didn't know that they were any different. They call them Fayetteville in Arkansas. They call it Barnett in Texas. He would call it not Mississippi, and he'd call it mine. But the point is that they were deposited 250 million years ago when there was an ocean that crossed across through North America, and they're the same thing. And so we found this. I mean, this was a really huge discovery that came from an incongruity. Now, the problem was that the thickness of the shale there was only about 50 feet thick. And in Texas, where they were beginning to make it work in the Barnett, that shale there was about 300 feet thick. And so we might have stopped again. Even though we had a clue, we might have stopped. But we had a team of geologists, geophysicists, and by then some engineers. In our business, it's sort of like a basketball team. You need people from different skill sets and talents to make things work. It's, one guy can dunk the ball, but one can shoot a three-pointer, and that's geologists, geophysicists, engineers that are really necessary to make the whole analysis. And we had these meetings began to say, review this. And, we might have stopped right then, but one of our leaders said to the group, okay, so it's only 50 feet thick here where we're studying it, but what happens if you look laterally on to the east and the west and the north and south? And the geologist who had worked that area for a long time said, well, it's probably just 50 feet thick. It's pretty much we don't have any reason to believe it'd be any different than that. And if it's only that, then this probably isn't a big deal. Well, one of our guys said, well, go ahead and map it anyway. Well, about 30 years prior to this, Texaco had drilled some wells over to the east, and so there were logs on those. I don't want to get too technical here, but they had drilled down so we could see what the thickness was, and we could incorporate that in the data. It turns out that off to the east, lo and behold, that shale, it just got thicker and thicker to at one point as thick as 500 feet thick. Now, I have to tell you, you're sitting close enough to me if I had my sleeves rolled up. Every time I tell this story, I get goosebumps right there because that was huge. That was an unexpected occurrence. Our guys didn't expect that. In fact, they expected it to be what it was where they were working. But it gives me goosebumps because that's the point at which I began to think this could be really, really a big deal. And so Drucker's unexpected occurrence there. Give you an example of unexpected occurrences that Drucker used in his article that I think is kind of interesting. The fellow, I'm not good at remembering names, but the fellow who invented Novocaine in whatever year, I don't remember that either, invented Novocaine specifically because he thought that in cases where doctors were doing amputations, they needed something to deaden the area instead of just putting a piece of stick in your mouth and giving you a snort of whiskey. And, he invented it for amputation surgeries. And well, guess what happened? And this is pretty amazing, but of course what happened is it became the standard for numbing your gum for dental care. And the guy that invented it spent the rest of his life, his career, going around lecturing about that was being a misuse of Novocaine. So sometimes, even though it works, you don't get it. So here we had the workings of incongruities, unexpected occurrences, and then came process-driven needs, because we had to figure out how to drill the wells, drill horizontally in it, do the completions, the fracture stimulations, and that was a long engineering process as well. And then to close on Drucker's scenario, the other part of it really was oil and gas prices got really high in that winter of 2000, 2001, and because that happened, we decided to go explore in this area. And had that not happened, it probably would have never happened today. So we really have all kind of four of those things that are at work. So, you know, how did we do some of what we've done? That's the story of the Fayetteville Shale. But internally within the company, I have told the innovation story over and over and over. And I've talked to people about that people and their minds are what is important in an organization. Nowadays, it's not often the heft of the largest man who can lift the largest load, but rather what comes out of the most creative and innovative minds within organizations that figure out how to build a much better product or discover a new resource or provide a new service. And so, you know, a lot of things go in there. Curiosity has to be there. When I was hiring people, I looked for curiosity. If I didn't see a spark of curiosity and adventure in a person's mind, I probably would not have hired them. And so Southwestern Energy has done well because we've spent a lot of time in recruiting curious people. You know, I've tried to incentivize and create an environment that fosters the generation of ideas, reward ideas both financially, but also even more importantly, I spent a lot of time walking around and hugging people and being appreciative of people's efforts. And I think the appreciation many times even goes further than anything else does. That's sort of how we got
Well,
there.
I think that's great. And in fact, I'd love to maybe talk a little bit more about this point about curiosity, because I do think it's unique and how much of a role it's played in your success and how human it is as a position in front of life. And when you allow your employees to be curious, you're allowing them a certain degree of freedom at that point. And I'm wondering how, as a CEO, you handle that, because that's also kind of risky for you, right? They're exploring, they're using their freedom, their curiosity. How does that work with your own goals?
I mean, to me, it's not a long answer. I've never worried about that. In fact, I've always worried more about the other, is that people would not feel compelled to innovate and create. And some organizations, some of you may work in some of them, and I've gone into some. In fact, I would say that Southwestern Energy, when I went there, was not innovative at all, really at all. It was more of this is the way things are. And I do recall going there and having some people say to me, boy, we're not in very good shape. I sure hope you have some good ideas. And I just said, look, hey, I don't have any ideas. This is dependent upon you. This is dependent upon your brain power and the group's brain power, and to create and find new oil and gas. I've always, to me, the freedom to think and create and innovate, those are it, and I just feel a part of it. I never felt as a CEO, I didn't feel any strain about people having freedom. To me, if that's what I wanted to have. Of course, we had budgets that we would work on, and we had approval levels, and I stayed close to the action. So, I was not, I was never in a kind of a situation where I was worried about somebody thinking and creating too much. It was more the opposite of that. because that business is, it is not, we sat last night and we listened to that beautiful music and heard the stories about composing and all. And the oil and gas business, which is about discovery, is about composing, and it's creative. It's important to have a technical background in geology or engineering or geophysics or something that you can apply, but that's only the beginning. That's like, okay, I have a tool set, but it comes in the mind. It comes in the mind, and it comes in the curiosity and the seeking and the desire to discover. So it's kind of a short answer for me. No. I'm kind of like, I can't answer that question because
it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. Maybe we could go at this maybe from a little different perspective, because I think a lot of what you impart to the culture of that firm comes from a certain position in front of life from you. The United States economy has been very successful over time because it values individual freedom. And our capitalism model seeks to reward those who have the biggest impact on our economy. But I think more recently, it seems like CEOs earn an enormous amount of money regardless of whether their firms do well or not. I mean, this seems particularly egregious with some of the firms on Wall Street during the financial crisis. And so sometimes it seems like the word freedom really just means a license to use your power over others. And so I think you've carved a more human path, and you're a great success story, and you've done well financially, but that reflects your firm's success. There was, I thought, an interesting article in the 2009 Financial Times that recognized you for adding the most value to an energy company relative to your compensation. So your compensation reflected the success of the firm, not that you were trying to take all that you could from it. And I think that speaks something to your integrity. It speaks something to how you look at your role. And I'm curious, how are you able to do this? And how do you think CEOs around the country should look at this question of their own compensation? So it's not just an abuse of power in the usage of their freedom.
Well, maybe take the easy part of that question first, and that is in your comment and the Financial Times article back in 2009 when they said I was the cheapest CEO per performance out there. I had some interesting comments from peer CEOs during that time. Of course, they knew what we had done, so they appreciated the value that we had created. Well, first of all, I'd rather be at that end of the scale than the other end that you were talking about. That would be uncomfortable, and I doubt that I would find myself there, and I may try to describe why that is. But in short, how did it happen? How did it happen was the performance of the company, the value creation of the people of Southwestern Energy, the discovery, even before the Fayetteville Shale, we had, go back in all those, but we were having successes that were adding value in significant increments. And so how did the recognition happen? It happened because the numbers, when an analyst calculated it, came out that way. And that happened because our performance was over the top. We had just outstanding performance, and we had reasonable compensation parameters within Southwestern Energy. But I may broaden the picture and the discussion here just a little bit to talk about CEOs, and to just talk about that whole scenario of CEO compensation. It's a difficult one to get right. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And when I say difficult one to get right, that's because the base salaries and the bonus systems that are set up with performance standards in those, and long-term incentives, which would be in stock options or some other kind of parameters over periods of time that would be measured. Those are set up at one point in time, and then many things can happen beyond the control of the company or the board or the CEO that affects what their compensation is in a given year in the way that it might not relate to the performance of the company in that year. And let's step even one step back. And the reason I can talk about this not as a CEO today, because I'm not one. I haven't been one for nearly 3 years. But I am the chairman of the board of directors of Southwestern Energy. Now, the board of directors of a company have the responsibility for setting the parameters, base salary, bonuses, everything else, for the CEO, and for monitoring it and making sure they're paying them fairly. So one of the first things that a board faces in regard to that is this. CEOs are not CEOs. CEOs are people. And competition for very talented people happens in a people marketplace. And so if you're on the board of directors of a company, I don't know how many of you are, but if you had the job to go out and recruit the very best CEO that you could to run J.P. Morgan or Southwestern Energy or Apple Computer, you'd find yourself competing with every other company who might want that same person, not unlike coaching in the NBA or in the NFL, which salaries may be too high also if you think they are. But the point is that there is competition for people, and in a free enterprise system, that person can go other places and work. And so I want you to understand that if you don't think of it that way, I'd suggest it's worth thinking a little bit about that. Then secondly, when it gets right down to the pay itself, again, it has to be competitive, or that person isn't going to stay if somebody comes along and offers them something somewhere else that's much better. And so you have to have a pay package that includes these different things, and those are all disclosed to the public nowadays. In fact, if you read, public disclosures, you probably won't read the compensation part, because it's now by rules and regulations required to be so detailed and so long that only the most earnest analyst on Wall Street will stick with reading it all the way through it. And by the time you are through it, you know what the basis for it is, but you don't know whether in the hell they've been paid right or not. But it's all required. Now, there have been some very abusive pay packages. There's just no doubt. I look out there and I see them. And where there are blatant situations, I just think it's one thing that is going to get it right. It's the responsibility of the board of directors. And so if you own stock in that company, call them, write them, call them many times. Believe me, when directors get phone calls from shareholders, you might not think they listen, but they do listen. So if it's really bothering you, call and make a stink. And if it really bothers you a lot and you think that it's abusive, certainly don't buy the stock of that company, because unless you believe that maybe the other way, that its pay is really okay. Look into the details. I think there's far too much of a cry in this area today, probably than there should be. But the point is, be active. And if you don't have an investment in a company, I guess you can complain about what someone else is making, but it'd probably be more productive to do something else. But if you're an owner of that company, complain like heck. Get out there. Do something about it. Now, your other part about that freedom one, about freedom is what was it you said? Freedom is just a license to use one's power over others. Man, if you wrote that question, I apologize for you. Seriously. Because to me, freedom is a positive word. It's not it doesn't even come to me that freedom would be something I have in order to have power over somebody. And maybe I misunderstand the question, but to me, freedom is a positive word. It indicates, the freedom of choice of where you live, who you marry, what products you buy, what church you go to, you know, it's your constitutional right. So
Sure.
that's sort of where
I brought it up more in the context that, I mean, it's very clear when you talk about how you ran Southwestern and in terms of the different things you've talked about, there's a very human way you've taken the responsibility and opportunity that existed there. And that's what I'm just suggesting, is that freedom can be used poorly. I'm not saying we need to have laws against using freedom poorly. I'm just asking about your own experience, and I think what you're talking about is frankly, it comes across the life of someone who takes that freedom and treasures it, you know, and approaches it with a lot of integrity.
Thank you.
That's for that.
Yeah.
So maybe actually just one last question, and along those lines, there's been a lot of scrutiny on companies after, you know, the technology bubble burst in 2000, and then again the financial thing recently about just abuse of regulations, abuse of maybe some power, but and it seems like in front of these crises, our sort of instinctive response is, okay, we got to regulate more. We need more laws. We need more rules. We have to come up with more ways so people are protected from themselves. There's sort of a limit to people's freedom, right? That's sort of the legal sort of response. And to some extent, and I see it at my own firm, the private sector's done a little bit of this too. You know, we got to come up with more procedures internally just to really make sure that things are, we manage people's behaviors as much as possible. And I'm struck by how you talk about a Southwestern, and I'm curious how you think about this, which is that, I mean, there's this curiosity, there's freedom, the formula you talked about here. How do you engage your employees in that vision and what you're looking towards, right? Because in that vision, I mean, I'm going to presume in that vision, you don't need as many rules to get people there. They're on board. Or maybe we do need rules. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, rules, I think rules are important for sure. But, you know, it can go a little bit too far at points in time. You know, freedom is a big word, and like I say, it probably means a lot of things to different people. It sure means having a choice and without freedom, we certainly can't regulate idea generation. I know that. You certainly can't have a planned economy from the top down. The USSR figured that, you know, that plan didn't work. Sure. And so having freedom and a free enterprise is critical, I think, to all of our survival, at least in a non-totalitarian sort of way. So, you know, freedom to me is sort of close to what other words come into my mind are words like, of course, curiosity, the why and how does this work, why does that happen, and curiosity leads in a way to adventure, if you think about that, really, because curiosity about something may lead you to go down there in that path, and that becomes an adventure. An adventure usually means some risk. And another thing in regard to business and in life, I think where there is adventure, for me at least, if there is no risk, I don't enjoy boating in my bathtub, you know. So, you know, I've taken my boat now and gone all from Vancouver all the way to Glacier Bay in Alaska and back for 2 summers, and that's the reason I retired from Southwestern Energy. Believe it or not, I gave up this really great high-paying job because I wanted to have another adventure in life. I wanted to go explore the northwest part of North America and captain the boat myself. And I did that with my wife and my friends benefited from it because I was willing to take the risk to learn how to do that and do it. So, you know, freedom has curiosity, it has adventure, then it has discovery, because along the way you find things. And then it has rewards. And so I think these things of freedom, they work both in a business environment and they work in a personal environment. If you have the freedom to create, innovate, think within a company, and you have curious people, they will adventure down some path, as Philip Shelby did, and recognize this Fayetteville Shale thing and have a discovery. And from the discovery then, you know, we as a country and as a world now have here in this country, 100-year natural gas supply at current usages, and Southwestern Energy and its employees have a great company, and the stockholders of the company made a ton of money. And these same things apply as I think about my boating experience. You know, there was risk involved in me deciding to take off and do that, but I wanted to explore. And I discovered, and and I'll go do it again. And so, you know, those things are important, but, you know, ultimately within a company and within the business communities, if I could say, you know, we need to have all of this curiosity, all these things, but there's one more thing there that I think has gotten lost, and that's why the tech bubble happened, and it's why the so-called financial crisis happened, which was more of a housing crisis in reality, is that what happened there is that values got lost. Instead of, you know, the tech bubble became about people just creating a company and taking it public and flipping it and making a bunch of money, and they didn't care whether it went on or not. And in the housing crisis, which became, you know, the buyer, the consumer, it became the person who, you know, sold the real estate. These people knew they couldn't afford many of these houses, and then that went all the way to the investment bankers in New York, and then they packaged these things up and sold these CDO instruments to people that didn't know what they were, and then the whole thing becomes a financial crisis. And what's really wrong is that all throughout that value chain, there was not value there. There was poor value judgments and value decisions. And so in business as well in your life, I think it's important that in business, it's important that you create, that you're doing something that's real. You create something of real value, either a service or a product that's really valuable. And in your life, it's the same way.
So, unfortunately, I've been asked to conclude this session, and I actually had thought about this earlier. I had the good fortune of spending 2.5 hours with you last night and an hour this afternoon. I thought that's just not going to be nearly enough time. You're not hearing a quarter of the great stories that Mr. Carell could tell us, but I do appreciate you coming out here and being with us. Just maybe a few thoughts in conclusion. I think what we heard today from Mr. Carell offers us a glimpse of a more human way to approach the world of business. He's just talking about freedom, talking about curiosity, both your personal life and the business life, but they aren't divided in that sense. And so I think whether you're an engineer, a teacher, a doctor, parent, student, or even a financial geek like me, I think what resonates here is the humanity of a life lived with an attraction towards reality, and sort of an arching towards life with a promise. I think Mr. Carell's curiosity and interest is very infectious. I mean, it clearly affected your employees. That's what really jumps out to me, is that passion you have infects everyone around you. It affects me, you know, just listening to you. And I suspect, you know, people out here.
It's not too late to get a degree in geophysics.
And, you know, you didn't need a set of rules to necessarily just to incentivize people to go that way. And not that compensation is certainly important and, you know, incentives are important. But that position in front of life, I think, is very compelling from what you're saying. I also think that the formula, which we didn't get a chance to really unpackage, is actually quite interesting, because you're able to, in what I think we're trying to do here, say, look, I've got this group of people that's got a great passion and interest in reality and life, and at the same time, we're real. We're not just going all over the place just because we're interested. We've got to look at what's reasonable in terms of an investment, as well as be passionate at the same time, that the two go together. I think that's very, very striking. And I think just again that broader point earlier about the freedom is essential to the success of us as a country. And when you talked about value earlier, and values, and you know, what happened, I think, in those two crises, and just again how you look at your employees, you know, the attention that you have, the compensation structure, all of those things sort of, I think, invite someone to want to do more because it's a more human way of living life and working. I think it's very, very compelling. Again, I'm sorry you missed out on the 2.5 hours we had last night. But again, thank you very much, Mr. Carell. And Mrs. Carell, I think you're in the audience. We appreciate you taking the time to come out here in wintry New York in January.
Thank you. And thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I do have one request, which is that if you wouldn't mind approaching the organizers of this great event and encouraging them to have this in the warmer climates of Houston next year.
There you go.
Thank you.
You bet.